The forge at Kellerman Industries had been burning for 93 years without interruption. Its fires had been stoked by human hands for every single one of those years. Calloused, scarred, blistered hands that belonged to men and women who understood that heat was not merely a tool, it was a language. You could read metal in the glow of a furnace the way a sailor read the sky. You could hear stress fractures forming in a steel beam by listening to the subtle hiss of cooling slag. You could feel in the marrow of your bones when a fire was running too hot or falling too cold. Marta Kellerman had grown up inside that forge. Her grandfather had built it with his own savings after the integration, back when humanity was still reeling from the revelation that they were not alone in the universe. The Velari Consortium had arrived with their sleek ships and their condescending smiles and their absolute certainty that humans were quaint, primitive, and largely irrelevant. They had offered humanity a place in the galactic community at the bottom. But humans had always been good at building things from the bottom. Now, 93 years later, Kellerman Industries was one of the largest independent metallurgy firms on Earth, supplying bespoke alloys to shipyards across 3 continents. Their work was sought after by alien and human buyers alike, though the Velari would never admit it publicly. There was something about human-forged metals that held up better under stress, something about the grain structure that resisted microfractures in ways that Velari manufactured equivalents simply could not match. The Velari said it was luck. Marta knew it was sweat. Which was why, on a gray Tuesday morning in late October, she found herself standing in the hearing office with her arms crossed and her jaw set like iron, staring at the smallest dragon she had ever seen. Stood, if you could call it, standing roughly 3 feet tall at the shoulder. Its scales were a deep, muted charcoal gray, almost the exact color of the slag that piled up behind the forge. Its wings were folded tight against its body like a pressed coat, and they looked too small to carry it anywhere meaningful. Its eyes were a pale, washed-out amber, the color of a fire that was just barely holding on to its heat. A thin wisp of smoke curled from one nostril, barely visible in the cold morning air. Behind the dragon stood a burly man named Heston Crew, the foreman of the furnace floor. He had a face like a topographical map of bad decisions, and a voice that sounded like gravel being dragged across sheet metal. "Before you say anything," Heston said, holding up one massive hand, "hear me out." Marta did not sit down, she did not uncross her arms. She simply stared at the dragon, which stared back at her with an expression that she could only describe as meticulously neutral. "Heston," she said slowly, "why is there a dragon in my hearing office?" "Because it applied for the job." "There is a dragon in my hearing office because it applied for a furnace worker position." "That's what I said." Marta closed her eyes. She counted to 5. She opened them again. The dragon was still there. It had not moved. If anything, it seemed even more still than before, as if it had consciously decided to become a statue. "Heston, we don't hire dragons." "Why not?" "Because we've never hired a dragon. First time for everything." "Heston." Heston shifted his weight and the floorboards groaned beneath him. He lowered his voice, which somehow made it sound even more like machinery breaking down. "I've been running the furnace floor for 11 years, you know that. You also know that 3 of my best hands quit last month because the Torvald shipyard started paying double what we pay. You know that the new hires we've brought in can't hold a consistent temperature to save their lives. You know that we have a contract for 400 tons of Kirin-grade steel alloy due in 7 weeks. And right now, we are behind schedule." Marta knew all of these things. She did not enjoy being reminded of them. "What I need," Heston continued, "is someone or something that understands fire, not just understands it, lives it, breathes it." He gestured at the small dragon. "This one showed up at the gate at 4 in the morning, 4 in the morning, Marta. It filled out the application legibly, I might add, better than half the humans who apply, and it waited, didn't complain, didn't make a scene, just waited." Marta looked at the dragon looked at Marta. Its pale amber eyes did not waver. "Its name," Heston said, consulting a crumpled sheet of paper, "is Vess." "Vess," Marta repeated. The dragon opened its mouth. A small, controlled tongue of flame emerged, not a burst, not a roar, but a precise, measured jet about 2 inches long that burned steady for exactly 3 seconds before extinguishing. Then the dragon closed its mouth and resumed its statue impression. Marta stared at it for a long time. "Does it talk?" she asked. "Haven't heard it say a word." "Can it understand us?" Heston shrugged. "Seems to. Followed every instruction I gave it during the preliminary eval." "Preliminary eval," Marta said flatly. "You gave a dragon a preliminary evaluation." "I gave it the same eval I give everyone. Check the furnace temps, adjust the dampers, maintain steady heat for 30 minutes. Heston paused. Something shifted in his expression, not quite respect, but adjacent to it. It held 2,200 degrees within a margin of 3 degrees for the entire 30 minutes. "Best performance I've seen in 11 years, Marta. Best performance your grandfather ever saw, and he built the damn furnaces." The silence that followed was thick enough to cut with a torch. Marta looked at the dragon again. It was small. It was quiet. It was, by every aesthetic measure, unremarkable. It looked like something that had been designed by a committee trying to make a dragon as inoffensive as possible. There was no majesty in its posture, no ancient power radiating from its scales, no sense of the terrible, world-burning creatures that featured in human mythology and Velari warning manuals alike. It looked like a furnace worker. Minimum wage, Marta said, 90-day probation. Standard liability waiver modified for non-human species. It stays on the furnace floor and out of the administrative offices. Heston nodded as if this were exactly what he had expected. One more thing, Marta added, pointing at the dragon without looking away from Heston. If it burns down my forge, I'm sending the bill to you. Fair. Heston turned and left the office. After a moment, the small dragon followed him, its claws clicking softly against the wooden floor. It did not look back at Marta. She sat down heavily in her chair and put her face in her hands. "What the hell am I doing?" she muttered to no one. No one answered. The furnace floor of Kellerman Industries was not a place for the faint of heart. It was a cathedral of industry, a vast, open space roughly the size of a football field, dominated by 3 primary blast furnaces that rose from the concrete floor like iron towers. The ceiling was high and crisscrossed with gantries, ducts, and conveyor systems that moved raw materials from the receiving bay to the charging floors. The air was perpetually hazy with heat shimmer and the faint metallic tang of molten iron. Sound was a living thing here, the deep, subsonic rumble of the furnaces, the hiss of steam, the clatter of tongs and chains, the rhythmic thud of mechanical hammers. It was loud, it was hot, it was dangerous. The humans who worked here loved it with a ferocity that outsiders found difficult to understand. Ves the dragon was introduced to the furnace floor on a Wednesday. The reaction from the crew was mixed, which was to say it was exactly what Marta had predicted. Some of the workers, the younger ones, mostly stared openly. A few pulled out their phones and took pictures before Heston barked at them to get back to work. One woman named Petra, who had been running Furnace 3 for 6 years, simply looked at the dragon, looked at Heston, and said, "You've got to be kidding me." But Heston was not kidding. And within an hour, Ves had been assigned to Furnace 2, the oldest of the 3, the most temperamental, the one that required the most careful attention to maintain a stable burn. Petra watched from her station at Furnace 3 as the small dragon padded along the catwalk toward the older furnace. It moved with a strange, careful precision, each footfall deliberate, as if it were calculating exactly how much weight to place on each claw. Its wings stayed folded. Its tail stayed low. It looked, Petra thought, like someone who was trying very hard to take up as little space as possible. Which was absurd. It was a dragon. Dragons did not try to take up less space. Dragons were enormous, loud, destructive creatures that the Velari kept on reservations and the human military studied with nervous fascination. Dragons were the reason Earth's first contact protocols had included a specific section titled, in case of fire-breathing megafauna, do not engage. This dragon was 3 feet tall and was currently climbing the steps to Furnace 2's inspection platform with the cautious demeanor of an elderly person navigating a staircase. Something about it made Petra uncomfortable, though she could not have said exactly what. She turned back to her own furnace and tried to focus on her work. The first week passed without incident. Ves did exactly what was asked of it. It monitored Furnace 2's temperature with a diligence that bordered on obsessive. It adjusted dampers and valves with a delicacy that seemed impossible given the size of its claws. It maintained heat levels so precisely that the quality of the steel coming out of Furnace 2 improved noticeably within the first 3 days. Heston reported this to Marta with something that was not quite a smile, but was at least in the same postal code. "It's good," he said, "really good. The consistency is up 14% on Furnace 2 output. Defect rate is down to almost 0. Marta nodded but said nothing. She had pulled the dragon's application file and reviewed it 3 times. There were things about it that nagged at her. The application was too clean. Every field was filled out correctly in neat, precise handwriting that leaned slightly to the left. There was no employment history. The section was left blank with a single dash where the applicant's previous job should have been listed. Under special skills, it had written fire management, temperature control, heat endurance. Under reason for applying, it had written a single word, purpose. Not employment, not income, not experience. Purpose. Marta had spent 37 years in the metallurgy business. She had hired hundreds of people. She had seen applications written by desperate immigrants who needed work to feed their families. She had seen applications from arrogant engineering graduates who thought they knew everything about steel because they had read a textbook. She had seen applications that were funny, sad, angry, and incomprehensible. She had never seen an application that made her feel like she was missing something important. She filed the thought away and returned to her work. By the end of the second week, the crew had developed opinions about Vess. These opinions fell into three categories. The first category, held by roughly half the workers, was cautious acceptance. These were the pragmatists. They did not care what was running Furnace 2 as long as the numbers were good, and the numbers were undeniably good. Furnace 2's output had become the most consistent in the entire facility. The steel it produced was passing quality checks with a near-perfect rate. If a small gray dragon was responsible for that, then the small gray dragon could stay. The second category, held by about a quarter of the workers, was active hostility. These were the traditionalists, the ones who felt that a human forge should be run by human hands. They muttered about scaled scabs and lizard labor in the break room. One man, a forge hammer operator named Briggs, went so far as to file a formal complaint with MARTA, claiming that the dragon was a safety hazard and that its presence constituted an OSHA violation. MARTA reviewed the complaint, noted that there had been 0 safety incidents involving the dragon, and filed it in the appropriate location, the trash. The third category, held by the remaining quarter, including Petra, was something more complicated. These were the observers, the ones who watched Vess carefully and noticed things that the others did not. Petra noticed that Vess never ate on shift. This was not in itself unusual. Plenty of workers skipped meals during long shifts, but Petra had been working furnaces long enough to know that fire needed fuel. A dragon that could produce flame, she had seen Vess breathe small, controlled jets during temperature adjustments, would need to consume something to sustain that ability. Coal, perhaps, or minerals, or something else entirely, but Vess never ate, it never took breaks. It never left the furnace floor from the moment it arrived in the morning to the moment it left at night. Petra also noticed that Vess never spoke to anyone. It responded to instructions, a nod, a shift of position, a small adjustment of a valve, but it never initiated communication. It never made sounds beyond the soft click of its claws and the occasional wisp of smoke from its nostrils. It was, in every measurable way, the quietest thing on a floor filled with roaring furnaces and clanging metal. And then there was the way it looked at the steel. Petra first noticed it during a late-night shift in the third week. She had come over to Furnace 2 to check on a temperature reading and had found Vess standing motionless on the inspection platform, staring down into the molten metal through the viewing port. The orange-white light from the furnace illuminated its scales and turned its pale amber eyes into something almost luminous. It was not watching the temperature. Petra could tell the difference. She had spent enough years watching furnace workers to recognize the clinical, calculating gaze of someone monitoring a gauge. Vess was not monitoring. Vess was looking the way an artist looks at a painting, the way a musician listens to a symphony. There was something in its posture that Petra could only describe as reverence. Then Vess noticed her watching, and the expression vanished. It turned back to its instruments and resumed its work as if nothing had happened. Petra went back to her own furnace and did not mention what she had seen. But she thought about it for a long time. At the end of the first month, Marta received a visitor. The visitor was not human. It was a Velari, tall, slender, with the characteristic silver-blue skin and large, dark eyes that made every member of the species look like they were perpetually judging you. It wore a tailored suit that probably cost more than Marta's car, and it carried itself with the easy confidence of someone who had never once in their life been told no. Marta Kellerman, it said, extending a hand with too many fingers. I am Counselor Prathan of the Velari Trade Liaison Office. May I have a moment of your time? Marta shook the hand. The texture was like cool leather and gestured toward a chair. You already are. Prathan smiled. Velari smiles were designed to look reassuring but always came across as predatory. I will be brief. We have received reports that your facility has recently employed a dragon. I employ 73 people, Marta said. One of them is a dragon. For what roles? Furnace maintenance and temperature control. And this dragon, it is performing satisfactorily. Marta leaned back in her chair. She knew this dance. The Velari did not make social calls. They did not drop by small human metallurgy firms out of curiosity. If a Velari counselor was sitting in her office, it was because the Velari wanted something or because they were worried about something. Satisfactorily, she repeated. Better than satisfactorily, the dragon is the best furnace worker I've ever had. Prathan's smile did not change, but something behind its eyes shifted. I see. And may I ask, did the dragon provide any identification, any documentation of origin? It filled out an application. A standard human employment application. That's the only kind we have. Prathan was quiet for a moment. Then it leaned forward slightly and the predatory smile widened by a fraction. Ms. Kellerman, I must be candid with you. Dragons are classified under Velthari conservation law as protected wildlife. They are not, how shall I put this, intended for industrial employment. The dragon you have hired may be, from a certain legal perspective, the property of the Velthari Consortium's Biological Preservation Authority. Marta felt something cold settle in her chest. She kept her face neutral. Is that so? It is. We would, of course, prefer to resolve this amicably. If you would simply turn the creature over to our custody, we will handle the matter without further complication. You would naturally be compensated for any inconvenience. How much compensation? A generous amount I am authorized to offer. No. The word hung in the air between them like a dropped anvil. Prathan blinked. I beg your pardons. No, Marta said again. The dragon applied for a job. It passed your eval, our eval. It's on a 90-day probation, same as anyone else. When and if that probation ends, I will evaluate its performance and decide whether to make it a permanent employee, same as anyone else. Until then, it is a worker at my forge, and I don't turn my workers over to anyone. Prathan's smile finally disappeared. Ms. Kellerman, I must advise you that. You must advise me of nothing, counselor. This is my forge, my property, my business. You don't get to walk in here and take my employees because your conservation laws say so. The dragon came to me. It chose to be here. Unless you can show me a document signed by the dragon itself saying it wants to leave, you can see yourself out. Prathan stood. Its movements were precise and controlled, but Marta could see the tension in its too many fingers. You are making a mistake, it said. I've made plenty. I'll add this one to the list. The Velthari left without another word. Marta sat in her chair for a long time after it was gone, staring at the door. Then she picked up her phone and called Heston. Keep the dragon on the floor, she said. Don't let it leave the building without telling me first. What happened? Nothing yet, Marta said, but something's coming. The something came faster than expected. 3 days after Prathan's visit, Marta arrived at work to find a notice taped to the main gate. It was printed on official Velthari Consortium letterhead and bore the seal of the Biological Preservation Authority. The text was dense and legalistic, but the gist was simple. Kellerman Industries was hereby ordered to surrender all dragons in its employ to BPA custody within 48 hours, or face seizure of assets and revocation of its galactic trade license. Marta tore the notice off the gate, folded it precisely in half, and walked inside. She spent the next 6 hours on the phone. She called the Human Trade Authority. She called her lawyers. She called the union representative. She called 3 different government officials who owed her favors. She called a retired judge who had once ruled against the Velthari in a landmark property dispute. The responses she received ranged from sympathetic to unhelpful to actively discouraging. The Velthari had legal standing on this issue. Their conservation laws had been written into the integration treaty, and while human lawyers had been fighting to amend them for decades, the current legal framework was clear. Dragons were Velthari property, full stop. Might be a loophole, said her lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Ewan, over a crackling comm line. If you can prove the dragon is sentient, truly sentient, not just animal intelligent, then it falls under different provisions. Sentient beings can't be treated as property under the treaty, but proving sentience in a dragon is difficult. They don't speak any known language. They don't use tools. They don't build. The Velthari have spent centuries arguing that they're just clever animals. What if it can communicate? Marta asked. Can it? I don't know. It hasn't spoken a word since it got here. Then we have a problem. Marta hung up and went down to the furnace floor. It was the middle of the afternoon shift and the floor was in full operation. The heat hit her like a wall as she stepped through the blast doors, a familiar, almost comfortable sensation that she had known since childhood. The furnaces roared. The workers moved with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this 1,000 times. The air smelled of iron and fire and sweat. Vess was at its station on Furnace 2. Marta climbed the stairs to the inspection platform and stood next to the small dragon. It glanced at her, a quick, almost reflexive motion, and then returned its attention to the furnace gauges. Marta looked at the gauges. Everything was perfect, 2,187 degrees, rock steady. Vess, she said. The dragon's ear, a small, almost imperceptible ridge along the side of its head, rotated toward her. There are people who want to take you away from here. No response, no change in posture, no wisp of smoke, just the steady, almost mechanical monitoring of the furnace. I'm going to fight it, Marta continued. But I need to know if you want to stay. I need to know if you understand what I'm saying. I need something, anything, that shows me you're not just an animal doing a trick. Still nothing. Marta felt something twist in her chest. Frustration, maybe, or fear. She had staked her entire business on an instinct, and now that instinct was being tested by a creature that refused to so much as look at her. Fine, she said quietly, fine. She turned to leave. And then she heard it. It was not a word, it was not a sound that any human language had a letter for, it was more like a resonance. A low, deep vibration that she felt in her sternum more than heard with her ears. It lasted less than a second, but in that second Marta was absolutely certain of two things. First, it had come from Vess. Second, it had meant something. She stopped, she turned back. The dragon was still staring at the furnace, but its tail, which had been perfectly still for the entire month Marta had known it, was moving. Just slightly. A slow, deliberate sweep back and forth across the metal grating of the platform. It was the first unconscious gesture she had ever seen the dragon make. Marta stood there for a long moment, watching the tail move. Then she pulled out her phone and called Ewan. I don't know if it's sentient, she said, but it just responded to me, not with words, with something else, something I felt. That's not going to hold up in court, Marta. I know, but I need you to stall. 48 hours. Give me 48 hours before they can enforce the order. I can try for 24, maybe. Give me 24 then. Marta hung up and looked at the dragon one more time. The tail had stopped moving. Vess was once again a statue, a small gray shape against the roaring orange backdrop of the furnace. But Marta had seen the tail move, she had felt the resonance. And she knew, the way she knew steel, the way she knew fire, that Vess was not what the Velari said it was. That night Marta did not go home. She sat in her office with the lights off and the door cracked open, watching the furnace floor through the narrow gap. The night shift was running, a skeleton crew of 6 plus Vess. The furnaces never stopped and neither did the small dragon. At 2 in the morning something happened. Vess left its station. This in itself was unprecedented. In the entire time it had worked at Kellerman Industries, Vess had never left Furnace 2 while on shift. It took no breaks. It made no trips to the break room or the restrooms. It simply stayed at its post, monitoring, adjusting, maintaining. But now at 2 in the morning, with only a skeleton crew on the floor, Vess climbed down from the inspection platform and began to walk. Marta held her breaths. The dragon moved through the furnace floor with the same careful, deliberate precision it always displayed. But there was something different in its movement now, a sense of destination, of purpose. It was not wandering, it knew exactly where it was going. It passed Furnace 1, it passed the slag pit, it passed the raw material storage area. It continued to the far end of the floor where the old section of the building began, a part of the forge that had not been actively used in years. Marta's grandfather had built the original forge there before the expansion. The old furnaces were cold now, their chimneys capped, their doors sealed. Vess stopped in front of one of the old furnaces, Furnace 0, her grandfather had called it. The original, the first fire ever lit in this building. The dragon placed one claw on the sealed door. And then it began to hum. It was not the same resonance that Marta had felt earlier. This was something deeper, something more sustained. It was a sound that existed below the threshold of ordinary hearing, a vibration that Marta felt in her teeth, in her bones, in the fillings of her molars. The old furnace seemed to respond to it. There was a faint, almost imperceptible glow that began to emanate from within the sealed chamber, a ghost of heat that should not have been possible in a cold, dormant furnace. Marta watched, utterly still, as Vess pressed its head against the door of the old furnace. The humming intensified, the glow brightened, and then, with a sound like a long-held breath finally being released, Vess exhaled. A thin stream of flame, no wider than a pencil, emerged from the dragon's mouth and seeped through the seal of the furnace door. It should not have been able to do that. The seal was solid iron, welded shut. But the flame went through it like it was made of paper, like the iron was simply a suggestion rather than a barrier. Inside the old furnace, something ignited. The glow erupted into full, brilliant light. For just a moment, no more than a heartbeat, Marta could see through the sealed door as if it were made of glass. Inside the old furnace, she saw not cold iron and dead ash, but a living fire. A fire that burned with colors she had no names for, deep ultraviolet, shimmering gold, a white so pure it hurt to look at. And in the center of that fire, she saw something else. A shape, not the dragon, something smaller, something that flickered and shifted like a flame itself. Something that looked almost like a set of instructions, a pattern, a blueprint rendered in pure heat. Then the glow faded. The door was just a door again. The old furnace was dark and cold and silent. Vess stood motionless for a long moment. Then it turned and walked back to Furnace 2, resuming its station as if nothing had happened. Marta sat in her dark office with her heart hammering against her ribs. She did not understand what she had just seen, but she understood with absolute clarity that Vess had a secret purpose. And she understood that it had something to do with fire itself. The next 24 hours were the longest of Marta's life. Ewan managed to secure a temporary injunction barely. The judge who issued it was the same retired jurist who had ruled against the Velthari years ago, and he did so with obvious reluctance, noting that the legal grounds were shaky at best. The BPA was given 24 additional hours to present its case, during which time Kellerman Industries was ordered to maintain the status quo. Marta used every minute. She did not sleep, she did not eat. She went down to the furnace floor and watched Vess work, and she thought about what she had seen in the old furnace. She thought about the pattern in the fire, the blueprint, the set of instructions rendered in heat. She thought about what it could mean. And then at 11 o'clock at night, with 14 hours left on the injunction, she climbed the stairs to Furnace 2 and sat down next to Vess. The dragon looked at her. Its pale amber eyes were steady and unreadable. "I saw you last night," Marta said, "at the old furnace." No responses. "I saw what you did, I saw the fire, I saw the pattern inside it." Nothing. "I don't know what you're doing, I don't know why you're here, but I know you're not just a furnace worker." The dragon's tail moved, just slightly, the same slow, deliberate sweep that Marta had seen before. "I'm going to lose this fight," she said. "The law is not on my side. In 14 hours they're going to come here and take you, and there's nothing I can do about it legally, unless you can give me something, anything, a reason, an explanation, a word." Silence. Vess, Marta's voice cracked and she hated herself for it. "Please." The dragon turned its head toward the furnace. The orange-white light from the viewing port illuminated its features, and for the first time, Marta saw something in its expression that she recognized. Pain. It was there for only an instant, a flicker of something raw and deep in those pale amber eyes. And then it was gone, hidden behind the same meticulous neutrality that Vess always wore. But Marta had seen it, and she knew that whatever the dragon's secret purpose was, it was not something cold or calculated. It was something that hurt. The dragon turned away from her and went back to work. Marta sat on the platform and felt, for the first time in years, genuinely helpless. At 6 in the morning, with 9 hours remaining, Petra found Marta still sitting on the inspection platform. "You look terrible," Petra said. "Thank you." Petra leaned against the railing and crossed her arms. She looked at Vess, who was maintaining its post with its usual robotic precision. Then she looked at Marta. "Heston told me about the Velthari," she said. "The whole crew knows." "Great. Briggs is saying we should just hand it over, save the company." "Briggs can go to hell." Petra almost smiled. "That's what I told him," she paused. "I've been watching it, you know, the dragon, more than anyone else, I think." "I know you have." Petra was quiet for a moment, then she said something that changed everything. "It's not maintaining the furnace, Marta." Marta looked at her. "What?" "The furnace, it's not maintaining the furnace. I've been tracking the numbers. Furnace 2's efficiency has improved by 14% since Vess started, just like Heston said, but I checked the fuel consumption logs. We're using the same amount of fuel as before. There's no chemical or mechanical explanation for the improvement. The furnace isn't running better because Vess is operating it well. The furnace is running better because Vess is doing something to the fire itself." Marta stared at her. "What do you mean, something to the fire?" "I mean the fire is different. I don't know how to describe it. It burns hotter, but it doesn't consume fuel faster. It's more stable, but it's not because of the dampers or the airflow. I've checked everything, Marta, every variable. The only difference is Vess. Whatever that dragon is doing, it's not operating the furnace. It's changing the fire." Marta stood up. Her legs were stiff from sitting all night, but her mind was suddenly electrically awake. "The pattern," she whispered. "What?" "Last night in the old furnace, I saw a pattern in the fire, a blueprint, instructions." Petra's eyes widened. "Instructions for what?" "For how to burn." The words hung in the air between them, and Marta understood them even as she said them. She understood them the way she understood her own heartbeat, the way she understood the difference between good steel and bad steel, the way she understood that fire was not just a reaction but a conversation. Vess was not a furnace worker. Vess was a teacher. It was teaching the fire how to burn better. Marta spent the next 8 hours in a frenzy of activity that would have been called insane by any reasonable standard. She called Ewan and told her to prepare a new filing not based on sentience but based on intellectual property. If Vess was doing something to the fire, something measurable, something reproducible, something that improved the quality of Kellerman's output, then whatever that something was constituted a trade secret, and the Velthari had no right to seize it. Ewan, to her credit, did not question the logic. She simply asked for data and began drafting. Marta called Heston and told him to pull every piece of temperature, fuel consumption, and quality data from Furnace 2 for the past month. She called the metallurgy lab and told them to run a full spectrographic analysis on the steel from Furnace 2 compared to the steel from Furnaces 1 and 3. She called a friend at the university, a professor of thermodynamics who owed her a favor, and asked him to come to the forge immediately. By 2 in the afternoon, the data was starting to come in, and it was staggering. The steel from Furnace 2 was not just better than the steel from the other furnaces. It was categorically different. The grain structure was finer and more uniform. The carbon distribution was more even. The tensile strength was 18% higher than the best steel Kellerman had ever produced. The microfracture resistance, the quality that made human forged steel superior to Velari equivalents, was off the chart. There's no known metallurgical process that produces these results, the lab director told Marta over the phone, his voice tinged with something close to awe. Whatever you're doing at Furnace 2, it's not just an improvement, it's a paradigm shift. Marta looked at the data and felt a chill run down her spine despite the heat of the forge. The Velari had spent decades trying to understand why human forged steel was better. They had analyzed it, studied it, run thousands of tests. They had concluded that it was an anomaly, a quirk of Earth's atmospheric composition or its magnetic field or some other factor that they could not replicate. But it wasn't an anomaly, it was the fire. Human fire, the fire that humans had been tending and learning from for a million years, was different. It had been shaped by human hands and human understanding into something that Velari technology had never been able to match. And Ves, whatever it was, whatever its secret purpose was, had taken that fire and made it better still. Marta looked at the clock, 3 hours until the injunction expired. She went down to the furnace floor one last time. The BPA enforcement team arrived at 5 o'clock. There were 6 of them, 4 Velari and 2 massive Bracken, the consortium's preferred species for intimidation work. The Bracken were 8 feet tall and built like boulders with arms. They wore the dark gray body armor of BPA enforcement and carried containment units designed for large wildlife. Marta was waiting at the gate with Ewan and a stack of documents. "Counselor Prathan," she said as the Velari emerged from the lead vehicle. "What a surprise." Prathan's expression was frosty. "Ms. Kellerman, the injunction has expired. We are here to take custody of the dragon." "You're here to seize my intellectual property, you mean?" "We are here to recover Velari biological assets." Marta handed Ewan's filing to Prathan. "Read that." Prathan scanned the document. Its expression did not change, but its fingers tightened on the papers. "This is absurd. You're claiming that a dragon's biological functions constitute a trade secret." "I'm claiming that the dragon in my employ is performing a function that produces a novel, previously unknown metallurgical result. That function is proprietary to Kellerman Industries. If you remove the dragon, you are stealing our intellectual property." "A dragon cannot hold intellectual property." "The dragon isn't holding it. I am. The dragon is my employee and the results of its work belong to my company." Prathan handed the documents back to one of the other Velari and stepped closer to Marta. When it spoke, its voice was low and cold. "Ms. Kellerman, I am going to be very direct with you. The Velari Consortium does not care about your legal filings. We do not care about your intellectual property claims. We care about the dragon and we are going to take it. You can cooperate or you can watch us take it anyway. The outcome will be the same." Marta stared up at the Velari. It was a full foot taller than her, and its dark eyes held no mercy. "Then take it," she said. Prathan blinked. "Excuse me." "Take it, go ahead, but I want you to understand something before you do." Marta stepped past Prathan and looked at the BPA enforcement team. All of them, the Velari and the Bracken and the drivers and the handlers. "That dragon has been in my forge for 5 weeks. In that time, it has improved our steel output by 14% and our steel quality by a margin that our lab director calls a paradigm shift. Every piece of data is documented, time-stamped, and backed up in 17 locations. If you take the dragon, that data goes public. Every shipyard, every metallurgy firm, every government on this planet will know that a dragon, a Velari biological asset, just revolutionized human steel production." "Silence." "If you take that dragon," Marta continued, "you're not just seizing an animal. You're admitting that dragons are capable of things your own conservation laws say they're not. You're admitting that they can innovate, that they can improve processes, that they can do work that your own technology can't replicate. And once you admit that, every conservation law you've built around them falls apart. Because protected wildlife doesn't revolutionize industries. Sentient beings do." Prathan's face had gone very still. "So," Marta said, "you can take the dragon, but the cost will be every legal framework you've used to control dragon populations for the last 300 years. Are you willing to pay that price?" The silence stretched, the BPA team stood motionless, even the bracken seemed uncertain. Prathen opened its mouth. And then the furnace exploded. Not Furnace 2, not any of the active furnaces. The old one, Furnace 0, the one that had been cold and sealed for years. The sound was like the death scream of something ancient and enormous. The sealed door blew outward in a shower of incandescent metal, and a column of fire erupted from the opening, not the orange-white fire of a blast furnace, but the impossible fire that Marta had seen the night before. The fire that burned with colors that had no names. The fire that was not merely hot but alive. Every person on the scene threw themselves to the ground. The BPA team scattered. The bracken actually retreated, which Marta had not thought was physically possible for a bracken. And from the center of that fire, walking with a slow, steady grace that bore no resemblance to the careful, tentative movements of the small furnace worker, came Vess. It was different. Its scales no longer looked like slag. They gleamed with a deep, iridescent luster, charcoal and silver, and a faint, shifting undertone of the same nameless colors that burned in the fire behind it. Its wings were unfurled for the first time, and they were not small. They were vast, each one wider than Marta was tall, stretching out from the dragon's body like twin canopies of smoke-colored membrane. Its eyes were no longer pale amber. They burned with the same impossible light as the fire, and they were fixed on Prathen. The Velthari counselor had gone very pale, which, on silver-blue skin, looked like a deathly gray. Impossible, Prathen whispered, Yura. Vess opened its mouth. And this time it spoke. The voice was not what Marta expected. It was not a roar or a rumble or a hiss. It was quiet, clear, precise. It sounded like the voice of someone who had spent a very long time choosing not to speak and had finally decided that the moment required it. I am Vesarith Venkaltharin, it said, 73rd scion of the Kaltharin line, last living student of the Forge Tender's art, and I have been waiting for someone to notice. The fire behind it pulsed, and the colors shifted, and Marta understood with a sudden breath-stopping clarity what she was looking at. Vess was not small. Vess had never been small. Vess had been hiding, compressing itself, making itself smaller and quieter and less noticeable because being noticed for a dragon of the Kaltharin line was dangerous. The Velthari had not classified dragons as protected wildlife because they were animals. They had classified them as protected wildlife because they were something else entirely. Something that the Velthari had spent centuries suppressing, containing, and erasing from the historical record. The Forge Tender's art, the ability to shape fire itself, not just control it, not just burn with it, but teach it, guide it, transform it into something more than a chemical reaction. It was a skill that predated Velthari civilization. It was a skill that the Velthari had encountered once long ago and had recognized as a threat to their technological superiority. So they had done what empires always do when they encounter something they cannot control. They had tried to destroy it. The Kaltharin were not animals, Prathen, Vess said, still speaking in that quiet, precise voice. You know this, your ancestors knew this, they burned our libraries, they shattered our forges, they slaughtered my teachers and my elders and my siblings. And then they wrote laws declaring us biological assets so that no one would ever ask what we had lost. Prathen's composure was cracking. Marta could see it, the slight tremor in its too many fingers, the rapid blinking of its dark eyes. The historical record is clear, it said, but its voice lacked conviction. Dragons were. The historical record was written by the people who burned it, Vess said. I have spent 40 years hiding in the margins of your empire. 40 years learning your language. 40 years reading your laws. 40 years looking for a place where fire was still respected, where humans still understood that fire is not just a tool but a partner. Vess turned its burning eyes to Marta. I found it here, it said. In this forge built by humans, maintained by humans, fueled by human hands that have understood fire longer than the Velthari have been a civilization. I applied for a job because I needed to be near the fire. I needed to feel it. I needed to remember what my people taught me before your people took everything. The column of fire behind Vess shifted, and the nameless colors began to resolve into something Marta could almost recognize. Patterns, schematics, blueprints rendered in pure flame not just for a single furnace but for an entire system. A new way of burning, a new way of forging. A fusion of human metallurgy and Kaltharin fire shaping that would produce metals unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. I hid because I needed to survive, Vess said, but I did not come here only to survive, I came here to give this back. It gestured at the fire with one wing. Everything I am, everything my people knew, it is all here in the fire, and I am giving it to you, to humans, because you are the only species in this galaxy that still listens to what fire has to say. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the active furnaces seemed to quiet, as if they too were listening. Prathan opened its mouth, closed it, opened it again. This changes nothing, it said, but its voice was thin. The laws. The laws say dragons are animals, Marta said, stepping forward. Her heart was hammering, but her voice was steady. She had spent her whole life around fire. She knew how to stand in the heat. That dragon just spoke to you. It articulated a complex historical narrative, referenced legal frameworks, and demonstrated a level of intelligence that your own species tests don't have a category for. If you try to claim it's an animal after this, you'll be laughed out of every tribunal in the galaxy. The BPA wills. The BPA will do nothing, Ewan said, stepping up beside Marta with her tablet in hand. Because I've been recording this entire conversation and streaming it to 17 news outlets since Vess opened its mouth. Congratulations, counselor. You're about to be the Velthari official who tried to kidnap a sentient being on live broadcast. Prathan went very still. The color drained from its face entirely. It looked at Vess, at the fire, at Marta, at Ewan's tablet, at the BPA teams who were standing very still and very carefully not making eye contact with anyone. Then it turned and walked back to its vehicle without another word. The convoy left. Marta stood in the fatting light of the column of fire and watched them go. Her hands were shaking. Her knees felt like they might give out at any moment, but she was standing and the dragon was standing and the forge was still burning. She turned to Vess. The dragon had folded its wings again. It looked smaller now, not as small as it had pretended to be, but smaller than it had been a moment ago. The iridescent luster of its scales was fading back to charcoal gray. Its eyes were dimming from impossible light back to pale amber. It looked tired. You could have done that at any time, Marta said. You could have revealed yourself on day one, why wait? Vess was quiet for a long moment. Then it said in that same quiet, precise voice, because I needed to know if the fire was still alive. Not the physical fire, the human fire, the understanding, the respect. I needed to know if humans still believed that fire could be more than a reaction. Zand. Vess looked at her, and for the first time since it had arrived at Kellerman Industries, its expression was not neutral. It was open, raw, vulnerable in a way that Marta recognized, the vulnerability of someone who has been alone for a very long time and has finally found a place where they might not have to be. You built a forge, Vess said, with your hands, with your grandfather's hands. You fed it every day for 93 years. You taught your children to feed it. You fought to keep it burning when the galaxy told you that you were too small, too primitive, too human to matter. A wisp of smoke curled from its nostrils, and this time it looked like something other than breath. It looked like a sigh. I watched you, Marta Kellerman. I watched you fight for a dragon you didn't understand because you believed that anything willing to stand next to your fire deserved to stay. That is what my people believed. That is what the Forge Tender's art was built on. The dragon turned its head toward the old furnace Zero, where the impossible fire was slowly dying back to a manageable glow. The patterns in the flames were still there, still visible if you knew how to look. Blueprints, instructions, gifts. Everything I know is in that fire, Vess said. It is yours now, not because I am giving it to you, but because you already earned it. You earned it with 93 years of heat and sweat and human stubbornness. You earned it the way fire has always been earned. Marta felt something wet on her cheeks and realized she was crying. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and laughed, a short, ragged sound that was half sob and half triumph. You're still on probation, you know, she said. Vess blinked, then slowly, carefully, as if it were a gesture it had not made in a very long time, it smiled. I would not expect anything less, it said. The news broke across the planet like a wildfire. Within hours, the footage of Vess speaking had been viewed by hundreds of millions of people. Within days, the Velthari Consortium was embroiled in the biggest diplomatic crisis of the century. The BPA's classification of dragons was challenged in every tribunal that would hear the case. Protests erupted outside Velthari embassies on 3 continents. The human government, for the first time in decades, took a hard line against the consortium, demanding a full review of all species classification under the Integration Treaty. The Velthari resisted, they always resisted, but the evidence was overwhelming and the political cost of maintaining their position was becoming unsustainable. One by one, the legal barriers began to crumble. But Marta did not watch the news, she was too busy. The patterns in the fire, the Caltherin blueprints were real. They were not metaphors or symbols. They were actual functional schematics for a new kind of forge. A forge that did not just burn fuel but shaped the fire itself, coaxing it into configurations that produced metals of extraordinary quality. It was human metallurgy amplified by Caltherin art, the fusion of 2 traditions that had been developing in parallel for millennia, each incomplete without the other. Building the new forge took 6 months. It rose beside the original Kellerman facility, a structure that looked like a cross between a cathedral and a blast furnace, with a central hearth that Vess designed and the human crew built with their own hands. There were no shortcuts. Every brick was laid by a human worker. Every pipe was welded by a human torch. Every system was calibrated by human eyes. Vess supervised, but it did not build. That was important. The Caltherin art was not about replacing human hands, it was about giving those hands something more powerful to work with. "You are the forge tenders," Vess told the crew one morning, standing before the nearly completed structure. "I am only the fire." Petra, who had been appointed lead operator of the new forge, looked at the dragon with an expression that had evolved over the months from suspicion to curiosity to something that looked remarkably like affection. "You know," she said, "for a legendary last scion of an ancient line, you're really bad at speeches." Vess's tail swept back and forth across the floor. "I am aware." The new forge was fired for the first time on a bright morning in May. Marta's grandchildren were there, 2 girls and a boy, ages 6, 9, and 11. They stood with the workers and the engineers and the government officials and the journalists, all of them watching as Vess walked to the center of the new forge and placed both claws on the hearth. The dragon was not hiding anymore. Its scales gleamed with their full iridescent luster. Its wings were half extended, catching the morning light like stained glass. Its eyes burned with the Caltherin fire, not blindingly, not overwhelmingly, but steadily, the way a good furnace burns. It began to hum. The sound was different from what Marta had heard that first night in the old forge. It was richer, more complex, layered with harmonics that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The workers felt it in their chests. The journalists felt it in their fingers. The children felt it in their teeth. And the fire came. It did not erupt, it did not explode. It rose gently, steadily, like a living thing waking up from a long sleep. It filled the hearth with colors that had no names. It spread through the forge's systems like water finding its level, filling every channel, every pipe, every chamber. It was hot, but it did not burn. It was powerful, but it was controlled. It was, Marta thought, the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. The gauges on the control panel, designed and built by human engineers to measure the new forge's output, were registered numbers that made the lead engineer put his face in his hands. The steel that came out of the first run was unlike anything that had ever been produced on Earth or anywhere else. Its grain structure was so fine that it appeared smooth under electron microscopy. Its strength-to-weight ratio exceeded the theoretical maximum for iron-based alloys. Its heat resistance was so high that it could be held in a bare hand moments after being removed from the forge. Marta held the first billet in her hands and felt the warmth of it, not the harsh, dangerous heat of ordinary forged steel, but a gentle, even warmth, like holding a sleeping animal. She looked at Vess. The dragon was standing at the edge of the forge, its wings folded, its tail still. It looked smaller again, not hidden, not compressed, but simply at rest. Its pale amber eyes were fixed on the billet in Marta's hands, and the expression in them was one that Marta recognized because she had seen it in her own mirror every morning for 37 years. "Pride. This is what my people made," Vess said quietly. "Before the Velari took it, before they took everything. We made metals that could hold the heat of a star. We made blades that could cut light. We made structures that could stand for 1,000 years without rusting or failing. We were not warriors. We were not conquerors. We were makers." "We're makers too," Marta said. "Yes," Vess said, "that is why I came to you." Marta looked at the billet in her hands. Then she looked at the forge, the human-built, dragon-tended, impossible forge that represented the combined knowledge of 2 species that the galaxy had tried to keep apart. Then she looked at her grandchildren, who were staring at the new forge with expressions of pure, unguarded wonder. She handed the billet to the youngest girl. "Hold it carefully," she said. "Feel how warm it is. Remember this. This is what fire sounds like when someone finally listens to it." The girl held the billet with both hands and looked at it with wide eyes. "It's singing," she said. Marta looked at Vess. Vess looked at Marta. "Yes," the dragon said, "it is." 3 years later, Kellerman Industries was the largest metallurgy firm in the galaxy. Not the largest human metallurgy firm. The largest, period. The Caltherin human forging process had produced materials that no other civilization could replicate, and the demand for them was insatiable. Shipyards across a dozen star systems used Kellerman alloys. The Velari, unable to match the quality through their own technology, had been forced to become customers, a development that Marta enjoyed far more than she would ever admit. Vess was no longer on probation. It had been promoted not to a management position because Vess had no interest in management, but to the title of Master Fire Tender, a role that Marta had created specifically for it. The title came with a salary, benefits, and a small office next to the new forge that Vess never used because it preferred to sleep on the hearth. Other dragons began to appear. Not many, not at first, but slowly, cautiously, over the course of months and years they came. They came from Velthari reservations and hidden mountain valleys and the deep, forgotten places where the survivors of the Kaltharin genocide had been hiding for 3 centuries. They came because they had heard the news, a dragon had spoken, a dragon had taught, a dragon had found humans who listened. Each one that arrived was small at first, compressed, hiding the way Vess had hidden, and each one, after spending time in the forge, after working alongside human hands and feeling the human fire, slowly stopped hiding. They were not all masters. Some were young, barely trained, knowing only fragments of what the Kaltharin had once known. But Vess taught them, and the human forge tenders taught them, and together they rebuilt something that had been thought to be lost forever. The Velthari never apologized. Empires rarely do. But they changed the laws quietly without fanfare, removing dragons from the biological asset classification and reclassifying them as an independent sentient species. It was a bureaucratic gesture devoid of warmth or remorse, but it meant something. It meant that the lie was over. Marta did not attend the ceremony where the reclassification was signed. She was on the furnace floor, running a new batch of alloy for a client on the other side of the galaxy. Vess was with her as it always was. 3 years, Marta said, watching the fire through the viewing port. The nameless colors had become familiar now, almost comfortable. She still did not have names for all of them, but she was learning. 3 years, Vess agreed. You never told me your full purpose. That day on the platform when you said you came here for a purpose. You told me what you gave us, but you never told me why. Vess was quiet for a moment. The fire shifted, and the patterns in it moved, not blueprints this time, but something more abstract. Something that looked almost like a memory. I told you I was the last student of the Forge Tender's art, Vess said. That was true. What I did not tell you is that my teacher died with a final instruction. She said, find the species that still loves fire. Give them what we know. Let them carry it forward because we cannot. That's a heavy burden to put on someone. It was not a burden, it was a purpose. Vess turned its head toward Marta, and its pale amber eyes held the same vulnerability she had seen that night on the platform, the vulnerability of someone who had been carrying something alone for a very long time. I carried it for 40 years before I found you, 40 years of hiding and watching and waiting. And then I walked through your gate at 4 in the morning and I filled out your application and I stood in your hearing office and I thought, please. Please let this be the place. Marta said nothing for a long time. The fire burned, the furnaces roared. The forge hummed with the sound of human hands and dragon fire working together, the way they were always meant to. It was, she said finally, it was the place. Vess's tail swept slowly back and forth across the floor. Yes, it said it was. The small dragon had been hired as a furnace worker. But it had its own secret purpose. And the purpose was this, to remind humanity that they were not small, that they were not primitive, that they were not the bottom of the galactic hierarchy, no matter what the Velthari said, no matter what the rankings showed, no matter how many times the universe told them to sit down and be quiet. Because humanity had fire. They had always had fire. And fire, as Vess had known all along, was enough.